Welcome. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the internal audit life cycle. We're also going to take a look at the different things that happen during a typical internal audit. Today, we're going to take a look at the steps in the internal audit life cycle. And to help me explain that and cover that in more detail, I have with me Kathleen Crawford, who has a lot of experience in internal audit, and she's going to help us better understand these elements that feed into what happens during an internal audit. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thanks, Fernand. Good to be here. So
Nice to
we're
have you.
Thank you. We're going to start off with the life cycle. The graphic that you're looking at here covers all 5 steps of the internal audit life cycle. Everything begins and ends with risk assessment. You'll see a little arrow that goes from follow-up back to risk assessment. So we start with risk assessment and we end with risk assessment. So we're thinking about the process, system, or functional area that we have been invited to or have decided to audit. And we look at what's going on inside the operation, what's going on outside the operation that may have an effect on how well it works.
What are
Uh,
some of the documents that you usually look for to better understand how things are being done within the area that's going to be reviewed?
Sure. Well, internally, of course, I want to know about policies, procedures. I want to know things about staffing. I want to know strategy, things of that sort. Outside, I'm also interested in the broader environment within which they operate. So, what industry are they in? What's moving and changing and shaking in their industry? What about laws, regulations, different kinds of requirements that are imposed from the outside of the organization?
Is this the phase also when you announce the audit? And how does that get done anyway? How do you notify the parties that are going to be involved that this is going to happen?
Different organizations will do it differently, but I would say a good proportion of them will typically give a number of weeks notice that they're going to be doing this project, and having that period of time, that much notice also gives them the opportunity to communicate with the stakeholders and see what's maybe new or different, so that whatever we do once we move into planning and once we move into field work will be relevant to what is actually going on. Not the,
So, as I
no, not what we imagine, but what is actually going on.
Okay, so you mentioned that there's a risk assessment that is done.
Mhm.
Sounds like there's one at the enterprise level. Looks
Mhm.
like there's one when you decide, okay, this is what we're going to review,
Mhm.
and then there's that risk control matrix also that is done at the project level when you decide what you're going to review, where you're going to review. You already told everyone about it. Now you have a risk control matrix. Is
Mhm.
that related to the risk assessment as well, kind of on a micro level of sorts?
Sure, absolutely. And we'll be able to see all of those different levels in an upcoming segment, specifically on risk assessment. So every one of these stages, as a matter of fact, has a lot more detail than we're going to talk about right here. So risk assessment is going to have several chapters, if you will, several segments for us to explore, planning as well. It's a very detailed, very methodical way of deciding what to look at any given point in time.
It looks like a lot of auditors will probably spend most of their time doing field work. So can you tell us a little bit more about
Yeah.
that?
Well, I see you picked up on the orange contrasted with the gray. That's absolutely true. So, beginning internal auditors are probably going to find that they don't get to see as much of the risk assessment and maybe not as much of the planning as their colleagues do. So, the supervisors and auditors in charge. These beginning stages are more of their responsibility. So an internal auditor coming in at the ground level is definitely going to spend most of his or her time in field work. They'll be working at the direction of one or more people who will essentially explain to them the rationale for why they're doing what they're doing. They'll give them some direction in terms of how they're supposed to carry out this responsibility. And let's take a quick look at the graphic, because It gets into a little bit more detail. They're going to be doing interviewing, so there's some interpersonal activity going on. They will read through things and prepare narratives, maybe in flowcharts. So flowcharts are really terrific to see in field work in terms of making a distinction between what you expected to find and what you actually did find.
Is walkthroughs is what sorry, are walkthroughs like the physical walking around, touring, observing the facilities, or is that something different?
Well, that's a particular phrase. That's a turn of phrase that's specific to internal audit. A walkthrough may not involve walking at all. It usually involves sitting at a desk next to someone who is explaining to you how a process or system works, and while they explain how it works, you ask them for screenshots of some of the actions, the decisions, the activity of a system or a process.
So
So
if I were auditing a resort or a cruise operation, I will still
oh,
be able to walk around and
you're just angling
observe
for a
things.
nice, you're just angling for a vacation.
Well, I just don't want to think of an auditor just sitting in a conference
Right,
room looking at ledgers all day. So
right.
they do get to go out sometime. Yes.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do.
Okay. Good. Okay. Okay. Thank you. I feel much
Actually,
better now.
yes, actually, any activity, any endeavor, if it is foundational to the success of the organization, auditors are going to be involved. So
Mhm.
let's take your resort example. There are certainly the tourism industry is huge, and there are auditors in it. And they're making sure that the customer experience is as presented, but they're also making sure that's what's behind the curtain is operating the way it's supposed to as well.
Okay, very
So
good. That's very
yes,
important, of course. All
it
the guests need
is.
to make sure that the food is safe
It
and
is.
their
Absolutely.
credit card information is properly taken care
All
of.
of that, all of that.
So after they do, actually, while they're doing the field work, if they find any issues, do
Mhm.
they get documented and captured during field work? So help us understand what happens if they find anomalies.
Sure. Absolutely. It should be captured during field work. And this is another aspect of internal auditing that I really appreciate is the amount of communication. So let's say I'm a new auditor and I read the procedure and it says that when the food is delivered to the table, it should look like this. And I observe that, but it doesn't look like that. There's something different about it. I know I'm making a silly example, but you can see the rationale between what we pay attention to, where we're auditing against a procedure or against a policy. Then, if we notice something that's different, we need to see, does that matter? What does it
Mhm.
matter if there's a piece of garnish or not a piece of garnish? So it means that the auditor needs to communicate with the folks that he's been communicating with to better understand, is this a problem? Is this not a problem? So the communication starts during field work. As soon as something unusual or unexpected is noticed, ask the question why. Why is
Yeah.
this
So
different than what I expected to see?
And I will imagine that the procedure begins in your following along with your example of the food preparation. It starts in the kitchen and the
Mm-hmm.
storage of the food. What needs to be kept cold is cold, and what needs to be kept warm is
Right.
warm, and what needs to be frozen is frozen, and so on. So all of
Yes.
these things, so it is safe, sanitary, and then we look into the presentation and make
Yes.
sure that it's going to also meet those requirements. So there's a whole pipeline of elements there. Okay, great.
Definitely.
So
Definitely.
so as they find issues, they will discuss them with the individuals who are familiar with the process and who are
Mm-hmm.
responsible for it. So what happens in that last stage, or not quite the last stage, I guess, is a reporting phase when you have
Right.
more of is that when an official communication occurs about the results of the review?
Yes. So the communication that I mentioned in terms of meetings and interviews and all sorts of things happens during field work. We'll also have conversations as we bridge from field work to to the reporting phase. So anything that seems to that has been unresolved is going to go in a draft audit report. So the draft audit report is going to include all of those different observations and hopefully some context for why these issues are there. Those will be discussed with management of the area processor system, informed with the information that we received as we conversed with the people who are on the front lines of this area processor system. And then there's some discussion, there's some debate, there's some discussion. What would we recommend that they change? What would we recommend that they put in place that isn't in place? In terms of some kind of control or some kind of action. And that discussion happens, and finally, the report morphs into the final deliverable, the outward-facing deliverable of our audit work. The inward-facing deliverable of our audit work is going to be our working papers, which will tell the story of what the auditors did, what the auditors found, and what the auditors concluded. So it will always be possible for us to follow that path that the auditors themselves followed and determine whether or not their observations were sound.
And then the follow-up phase is where now the auditors verify that the issues identified were corrected appropriately. Is that what happens then?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you'll notice that line from follow-up back to risk assessment. We confirm or refute whether or not the agreed upon corrective action was taken and taken in the way that that management of the area or processor system agreed to. That may affect our risk assessment, because if there were some matters of significance in our audit report, then we want to be able to level set risk assessment in future to make sure that it is now reflecting the landscape of risk for this particular area once the corrective action has been taken.
Okay, so if the issues keep coming back, if they're recurring, then that's concerning because they haven't taken appropriate actions and the problem is still going on. So certainly an indication that perhaps we haven't gotten to the source of the problem, the root cause of it,
Right.
or they just haven't been diligent enough in attending to those things. So there are so many things that we just covered in that life cycle. Could you break it down into some more discrete steps for us so you have a little bit of a list of sorts, just kind of maybe the top 10 steps or so?
Sure. Actually, the top 10 steps begin with risk assessment, not unlike the graphic that we just spent some time with. Risk assessment happens at multiple levels. That's a topic that we'll get into in another session. But for now, let me just say that risk assessment is looking at the entire enterprise and its balance of risks and concerns and deciding what the audit group, the audit department, the audit division, and its members have the expertise, the time, and the appropriate level of risk to look at. So we select auditable areas, almost like pulling a volume off the shelf of software or of reading material. So we select an auditable area and a client. We move into review of those policies, procedures. This is setting us up for some success in terms of what we're going to do in field work. Holding an opening meeting. This is an opportunity for us to converse with different stakeholders, let them know the fundamentals of our approach, what are we going to do, and then we get into field work and we start studying and sampling on transactions and different activities. We could call that performing testing, and that is performing testing. But we also want to make sure that we document internal controls. So we have an understanding of risk. Now we want to know how is the risk balanced? So we have to look at the system of internal controls and prepare some kind of documentation around that. A risk control matrix is typically the result. The audit program flows from that, and then we perform our testing. As Hernan and I discussed on the previous graphic, we prepare any issues, observations that need to be addressed, need to be discussed with the client. We wrap things up. We have some kind of exit meeting or exit conference, and then we're able to draft the audit report, issue it, and perform follow-up.
Excellent. So, thank you very much. That was very helpful to come up with a succinct list like that, and just be able to narrow it down a little bit, just so we can put our hands around this world. But as we're thinking about the different things that auditors review, right? We understand now that not every internal auditor is an accounting or finance expert. You have a lot of compliance elements and other kinds of reviews that are performed. So, if you think in terms of what things are reviewed, right? We just talked about food preparation and looking at a cruise operator, a resort, and so on. So it looks like there's quite a broad selection of areas to review. What are some of the auditable areas that auditors are likely to engage in reviewing?
Well, everything is auditable. Everything is auditable.
Okay.
But we don't have all the time in the world, and if we want to give enough attention to anything, we have to be very deliberate, very tactical. So some of the ways in which we determine what we're going to audit is to look at policies and procedures, practices around the enterprise. Another way that we might look for areas that are ripe for being audited is to look at profit centers, cost centers. We could also consider the general ledger of the institution that we are employed by. Information systems. In my nonprofit work, I spent a lot of time looking at major programs and major contracts across the 2 states that the nonprofit that I worked for operated in, and what were those requirements, and then making sure through a series of audits that those requirements were being met. I'm also a huge fan of looking at organizational charts and job descriptions to get a feel for how different lines of service or different products are rolled out. So I might be interested in functional units and how they fit into the larger enterprise. We might also look at transaction systems. So how does money flow? How do our purchases flow within an organization? How do our payments flow? So that leads to financial statements in a broader context. I also mentioned earlier that from an external perspective, we want to make sure that the organization is operating in a way that is faithful to the rules of the industry or the rules of a particular subset of the industry. So we look at rules, we look at laws, we look at regulations. Any and all of these things can help us determine what deserves to be audited at any given point in time. It's also a way to bring in some creativity, because we could find ourselves doing the same thing over and over again. Maybe not likely because of what I said earlier about risk assessment. Having some creative thinking around all of these different areas, I think, is really warranted.
Great. Thank you, Kathleen. So this is very helpful in helping us understand, and I like your expression that anything can be audited. But then again, we have the risk assessment process that's going to help to decide what needs to be reviewed, how often, and to what extent. Now, your last list of items, you have a number of items mentioned there related to compliance. You have some accounting, some finance, some business, some IT, maybe a little legal elements there with the contracts as well. So it definitely shows that internal auditors do a lot of different things and that their work is quite diverse. So thank you very much for helping us better understand the life cycle of an internal audit and the areas that are usually reviewed by their work. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
If you like this series, subscribe to the ACI Learning YouTube channel to enjoy more audit-related content.